play the video. It's time to start the show. We're diving deep today with stories on the go. Cloud native dreams unfold, the journey to be told. With Joe Beda in the lead, inspired and so bold. It's my journey episode. Let's explore the road with Joe Beda by our side. Cloud native dreams collide.
Welcome everyone to the inaugural episode of My Journey, a podcast that's going to explore the stories of cloud native pioneers. I'm your host, Steve Wade, and I couldn't be more thrilled to kick off this series with a true legend in the field. Today we've got with us Joe Beda, co-founder of Kubernetes, now semi-retired technologist, who was the driving force and continues to be the driving force in cloud native innovation. Joe, it's an absolute honor to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we dive into your kind of incredible journey, I want to personally say how much your work has impacted me. And also I know countless others that will be watching this. Like the Thank God It's Kubernetes series was a game changer for me. Like I even got the chance to dual screen with Duffy and we went and installed GitOps and did some Flux stuff, which was great. And I learned so much from that and, got to present. And I want to thank you personally and thank the rest of the TGIK team for their kind of invaluable contributions that they gave.
Well, thanks. I mean, for us, I think it was great for me to be able to learn with everybody else also. And I think that's kind of what made it so much fun, is that we were all figuring stuff out together a lot of the time. And I think that's just a big part of the community that we've all built together.
Yeah, I agree. It's, it was like mob programming on every week. It was really enjoyable. So let's start at the beginning, Joe. Can you share kind of how you started in the tech industry and kind of what inspired you to pursue that path?
Well, I think, my father was a programmer, and so growing up, he was an entrepreneur also. And so, I always was around computers, and for me, like the default thing for me in terms of a career was to go into something in technology with programming. And so I went off to college and I'm like, oh, I don't want to do that. I want to do something different. And I had dreams of, doing some type of sort of real engineering. But for whatever reason, I think I'm like, oh, I'll just do the easy thing. And I ended up getting a computer science degree. And I think, early on, I did some internships at Microsoft. And, at the time, and I think probably still is the case, Microsoft internships here in Seattle are really pretty amazing and special. They did a great job of bringing a bunch of people on, embedding you in a team, giving you real work to do, a lot of support in terms of helping you find a place to stay and building community there. And so then I joined Microsoft out of college, worked on, IE. And that was an interesting sort of journey in and of itself. I think picking, your first opportunities. Oh, the dog's going because the garbage truck is out there. Picking your own, your first opportunities is really a critical thing, because I think it does set the tone on what you're optimizing for in your career. And for me, I think, after doing a couple internships, I could have either, I believe, like gone and worked on the NT kernel team, or I had a choice to go and work on Internet Explorer. And, and I was looking at it, and, and part of my calculus at the time is that, like, okay, a lot of smart people who've been in the industry forever solving hard problems in the kernel. But I looked at IE. I mean, this was IE4. This was, probably 97, I want to say. And so like the internet was really just getting started in a lot of ways there. And I remember joining the IE team thinking, like, I don't know if this internet thing's going anywhere, but this is going to be the dynamic place to work. This is going to be where I'm going to learn the most, where there's going to be, people sort of like taking chances and taking risks. And so I think, there is something to be said for chasing the shiny, exciting areas, because that's when the opportunities are going to present themselves.
So it still amazes me that you worked, your first professional role was in the IE team. So kind of what was that experience like? And was there a kind of anything that kind of really sticks with you through the rest of your journey in IT that you learned when you were in the IE team?
I mean, yeah, I think a couple of things. So number one is, I was joining, at the ground floor. And so I think looking back on the experience now, there were layers of, strategy and politics and everything else that was going on above my head at that time that I just didn't have a good sense of. Um, and so, I try and remember that, when I'm working with teams, is that, it's easy sort of in some of the positions I find myself now to be thinking about sort of like what is the market and but at the end of the day, you have to create a motivating, clear story for the folks who may not have and live and breathe that type of stuff. And so that sort of, never forgetting sort of what it's like to sort of be working on, a small part of something big, I think was interesting. I think understanding the just the explosion of interest and being sort of, hey, I'm writing code that a ton of people are going to use. Seeing some of these really foundational technologies being invented at the time. I think, it's easy to look back on this and say, hey, IE didn't, adhere to standards. And I think that's looking at IE, as it was frozen in time with IE6. But back when we were working on the team, these things, there were no standards, or if they were early enough and sometimes wrong. And so there was a lot of sort of just churn going on there, and sort of, being part of that and understanding the excitement and the opportunities there, I think was really interesting. And then I think finally, this was, I was in Microsoft during the whole antitrust investigation that led to the consent decree and all that. And I've seen this other places through my career where it's easy to look around at the people that you're working with thinking like, I'm a good person, these people are all good people, we're doing good work. That was all true. And yet you can be in an industry, there can be other forces that are maybe not good. And so
Yeah.
there's definitely sort of a gap between the way you see yourself, the way that you see the work that you're doing, and perhaps the way that the rest of the world is seeing your work. And that was never more apparent for me than when the antitrust stuff was going on. And I also saw some stuff out of my executives that I didn't like, right? And it's hard to be like, hey, I like this person, I work for them, I have a relationship, and I don't agree with what they're saying, and I think it's bad. That's always really hard to square too.
Yeah, and were there any kind of lessons you learned during that kind of phase, especially like, you've got to, they talk about kind of communicating up and communicating down and sideways. Were there any kind of tools and techniques that you learned during that period, specifically talking upwards to those leaders?
Um, I think, I'm kind of bad at that, to be honest. And so some of that is knowing what you're good at and what you're bad at. I think, through my career at Microsoft and, so after I joined the Windows team, and we were working on this UI framework called the Windows Presentation Framework, codenamed Avalon. It's still out there. People are still using it, which is kind of crazy. And I was always frustrated because I saw opportunities, I saw changes, I saw that needed to be made, I saw, things that we were doing wrong. And I always struggled really hard to communicate those things. And so I think, same thing at Google, where, I was always in a position where I wanted to push for change, and I wasn't necessarily always super effective at doing that. And I think, one of the lessons that I learned out of that is there, there's an analogy I like to use here, which is like, if you're ever into boating, right? There's this sort of, as long as you're actually talking about displacement holes, there's a theoretical maximum speed that a boat can go, um, based on the shape of the hull, mostly its length, and the viscosity of the water that it's going through, right? And you hit this point where you can put more power into it, but you're going to get diminishing returns. And so
Mm,
you just push harder, but the force is mostly, it's, vortexes behind you, cavitation, that actually hold you and sort of hold you back. And I think it's similar within organizations. I think when you're at a big company, you can push really, really hard, but what you can do is create more turbulence for yourself, and you don't ultimately end up going faster. And so understanding what can you do that is more than just working and pushing harder and advocating harder. Can you change your message? Can you change the shape of your hull so that you can actually fundamentally move faster and communicate better? And so I think, that definitely is one of the lessons that I learned early on, is that just pushing hard won't always get there. You have to change your message. You have to change how you're relating to the organization to be effective.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. Like, I'm actually going to use that moving forward because it sums it up really nicely, right? It's exactly, working those long hours and keeping on grinding and grinding and grinding. You may not get anywhere, but you're just kind of, yeah,
Yeah.
you're trying to speed up, but you're not really achieving the end goal, which makes a ton of sense. So obviously,
Yeah.
I
And
know
I think that applies both to, you and the code sort of like pushing on productivity, right? And I think everybody's been there where they're like, I'm so tired, I need to take a nap and I'll be more effective. But I think, there's another aspect of this where I think, as systems people building systems, you like to understand, hey, if I impact something here, it's going to have another impact here. I think that works both within technical realm, but also in the people realm also. So when I talk about sort of pushing hard, it may be pushing for ideas in the organization in terms of like, hey, I think we should be doing this differently, or we're missing this opportunity. And just like burning yourself out, pushing against something that's not moving, you can do the same thing at an organizational level. So this really does apply both in terms of technology, but also in terms of people systems.
Yeah, I agreed. Right, it's the age-old saying that the tech is the easy part and the people are the difficult part.
Exactly.
And it still holds true. So, and then obviously you left IE and you moved over to Google, and I know you were instrumental in starting, Google Compute Engine, and then the big K, Kubernetes. Um, can you walk us through that kind of transition, and then like the genesis of Kubernetes and kind of how it came about?
Yeah, so I think, through my career, I've sort of done things in sort of 4 or 5 year increments where I feel like to do anything big, you have to dedicate, some time to it, right? And so I think, there are reasons why people hop jobs, and some of those are good reasons, sometimes there's bad reasons. And so but I do think that ultimately I wish everybody would find a place where they feel like they have a team, they have a support, they have a problem that they can sink their teeth into and really give a good 3 or 4 years to it. And for me, I think about this as sort of tours of duty. And so for me, starting out my career on Internet Explorer, that was a good 3 or 4 years. And then working on some of the higher level UI stuff at Microsoft was another good 3 or 4 years. And then you hit these sort of natural inflection points where you're like, hey, I feel like I've taken this for a while. I have to decide what the next thing is for me, or at least for me, I sort of get that itch to change things up at that time. And so, right around this was when middle of the Vista cycle, there was a big sort of engineering reset called the Longhorn Reset,
Hmm.
which changed a lot of stuff. And so it was a natural inflection point where I'm like, hey, do I want to stay at Microsoft or do I want to look further afield? And so some folks that I had worked with in IE had sort of moved over to Google. I had no idea what they were working on because it was all very hush hush, but they're like, hey, come join us. And so in some ways, I made the leap to Google sort of sight unseen. I knew that there were some people that I enjoyed working with, that I worked well with. I trusted them to be working on some interesting problems. And so, this is, I think, another theme through my career where I've really focused on who I'm working with and making sure that it's going to be a good environment. In some ways trumps what I'm working on, how much I'm getting paid, I think there's a lot of reasons why, you can weigh and pick and sort of rank opportunities. And for me, the people that I'm going to be working with is a big part of that. And so that's what brought me to Google. That project ended up being Google Talk. And so I learned a lot about real-time communication, did some work to hook Google up to the telephone system. Um, did that for, probably 2 or 3 years, and then switched over to doing some ad stuff, which was really interesting. It was a lot of machine learning, sort of what we would call AI now, before AI, about sort of how do you optimize ads and give people good suggestions for what and how they should be advertising. And then we had our second kid, and I came back to work, and I could not make myself care about ads anymore. I just couldn't do it. And so there was a director in the Seattle office that was looking to start something up at sort of a systems level. We toyed around with some ideas that eventually became Chromebooks, but the Chrome team in Mountain View really took that and ran with it. And so I think that's a place where, being in Seattle probably hurt me career-wise, because the center of gravity for Google was definitely down in the Bay Area. And even though we're in the same time zone and everything, that was enough of a distance that it was difficult for us to really participate in sort of the early sort of Chromebook efforts, when the sort of center of gravity there was down in the Bay
Did you ever
Area.
consider moving down there, or was it always not? Obviously, you'd set up base in Seattle, so
Yeah, I mean, it's like, you set down roots. Like, so my wife's an MD, and so, she's always you know, had a job here that she's really, enjoyed and been tied to. And so, and then eventually we had kids, and it's like, it gets harder and harder to move. And I've never been in love with the Bay Area. I mean, I think, the city I like a lot, but it's just, I think for me, the I think the monoculture that you get in the Bay Area, for some people, it's a feature that everybody's there and that's all everybody talks about 24/7. For me, that's not something that I was interested for. I wanted to have, neighbors and friends and, folks that weren't all in the tech industry.
yeah, I can respect that.
That doesn't mean that all my neighbors aren't in the tech industry. It's just like, you
There's a
want
few
to
that
you
aren't.
want to like have those opportunities. Yeah. Um, and then the other thing that's interesting is that through my career, whether you're talking about IE, the Windows Presentation Foundation, Avalon, even Google Talk, most of that stuff was developer facing and building platforms. And so I think a big part of the sort of formative sort of way that I view the industry is through the lens of building platforms. Because say what you will about Microsoft with, Ballmer up there bouncing, yelling developers, 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 the idea of building platforms and creating opportunities for other companies and and sort of this zero, like this positive sum, we'll all work together to build something great, that is very much in Microsoft's DNA. And that's something that I think imprinted on me very, very early, is that you see success when you create these win-win situations between you and third parties and the end user.
Yeah, so kind of I'm gonna jump a little bit forward to the main conversation starter, which is definitely going to be Kubernetes. So what what kind of were there any unconventional kind of approaches or ideas that you kind of experimented with during, let's call it, the first 6 months, the first year of Kubernetes, that others in the industry might find surprising?
um I think, there was, I think, looking at, like, I think one of the main competitors at that time, or at least sort of the main system of this space, was Mesos. And and I think, looking at Mesos and sort of what it meant in terms of being a standard platform, and then looking at what Docker had been doing, um, I think for us, one of the lessons that we took away from Docker, and that I took away from my experience building GCE, after the Chromebook stuff didn't pan out, um, was that the APIs are the core of what you're building, and building a good API and building good API infrastructure is incredibly important for a project like Kubernetes, right? And so I think it was interesting because we looked at Mesos, and it had this really interesting and efficient scheduler core, but there was nothing but like, and then you built sort of framework applications on top of that. And so things like Aurora or Chronos, there were different sort of like personality or subsystems that were built on top of that scheduler core. So Mesos was a scheduler, but it was not something that end users typically dealt with directly. They would install something like Aurora on top of it, or and then they, or Marathon, or I think was one of, I don't know, I'm trying to remember all the
Marathon, yeah.
frameworks, and then they would interact with those things. And so what you would find is that there were no common API abstractions or patterns between Aurora and Chronos, or Aurora and, some of the Hadoop stuff. And so there was limitations in terms of what was the Mesos community? Did it actually share tools? Did it share knowledge?
Mhm.
And so I think for me, one of the lessons from building GCE is that we looked at like AWS and EC2, the APIs that they had, and more than anything, the community that they had. You could go on Stack Overflow or the forums, and for whatever problem you had, there would be other folks helping you out there. There would be a base of knowledge that everybody assumed and built on. And that really, really, really was the power. And you saw that happening with Docker. That was part of our goal for what we wanted to build with GCE and GCP. And I think that very much influenced Kubernetes. We wanted Kubernetes to be a unifying community thing versus just a technology base. We wanted it
Yeah.
to be a place where folks could come together and it started with the common API. And so that was really my focus from the get-go, was making sure that we took the API seriously.
So were your kind of main role on the initial kind of core API kind of configuration and design at the beginning?
Yeah, I think I did. I did a lot of like pre-work on the API. So I designed the API for GCE. I learned a lot from that. I looked at sort of a bunch of other APIs, whether it be EC2, OpenStack, stuff like that. And took a lot of ideas there. And I think we made some mistakes with the GCE API. And then I brought a lot of that stuff forward to influence Kubernetes. And so I think one of the key things there, just bringing these lessons forward. And I think, and I can sort of look at technical details going all the way back to the way we did layout in IE. But this idea around sort of intent and status, sort of spec and status, and I'm trying to remember
Mhm.
what we originally called it, what I did. Eventually it got changed to spec and status. But that idea of like, here's what you want, here's reality. Let's actually see how these things compare and converge over time. That I think was very much influenced from the lessons from GCE. And, for me, tracing all the way back to work that I did early in my career. Um, there were also a lot of influences from other places inside of Google and the wider community. I think, a lot of lessons from Borg about how they did stuff. But I think the idea of controllers driving towards sort of like spec and status driving to completion, that was not something that was really front and center with Borg or even Omega.
Interesting.
Omega never really shipped in sort of a full sort of form. And so that was really something that I think at least I took a lesson from GCE and applied it through to Kubernetes.
So how big was the initial kind of core team, Joe, out of interest? Because I assume it was relatively well sized, but I genuinely have no
Um,
idea, and it's always been a question that I wanted to ask you.
yeah, I think, early on there were like, I want to say like, the initial ideation was me and Craig and Brendan. We started putting some ideas together. Um, some other senior engineers joined in very, very early. And I think the two names that I really want to bring up would be Vile Akis, who's now, he did some Knative stuff, is now at ChainGuard. Vile's hilarious and amazing. And then Tim Hawken, who obviously is just the heart and soul of Kubernetes at this point, which is got involved very, very early. And it was, I think, politically risky for them to do that because they had been working on Borg and in some ways Omega, and to join in on this sort of speculative open source thing. There were a lot of people who didn't get it inside of Google, but I think Tim's been fundamental to open source communities for so long. I think it just came naturally for him. He saw the opportunities there, and so, once we got approval to open source it, we started bringing on more folks, and others joined, and even folks from the outside. I think, working with Red Hat out the gate. At some point, we brought them along so that they were going to base the next version of OpenShift on Kubernetes. That was a big deal. They brought in a lot
Mhm.
of their concerns and ideas, which I think made the project better. But it was, in some ways, it was probably a team of like, I think the core team at some point was probably like early on was maybe 10 or 15 engineers.
Okay.
But uh, a lot of them were very senior engineers that had a clear idea of where we were going. And so there wasn't a lot of, back and forth. It was a lot of like, well, obviously we need to do this, just go off and do it type of things. Now that changed over time as like things became less clear and, there were some harder decisions. But that core group, the direction that everybody was running towards and sort of what the right thing to do was pretty well understood. And I think that definitely served us well.
Definitely. So, like the impact that Kubernetes kind of had on our industry cannot be overstated, right? You just look at the size of KubeCon alone, and I remember the first couple in London, and it was very, very small. I went to Paris, and it was 13,000, and it somewhat overwhelming, but also incredible at the same time. Like, what's it like from your side, kind of seeing the thing that you created, kind of in the bunker with a bunch of guys, kind of being so fundamental to cloud native now?
I mean, I think, me and Brennan and Craig, I think, early on we had the idea that it could be big, but I don't know. I mean, when you have the right group of folks, you come up with a lot of ideas and you're like, hey, that could be huge, right? And it doesn't always pan out that way. And so I think, my attitude is like, it's just a magic sort of mix of things that come together to make something like that happen. It's some of it is, being in the right place at the right time, having some of the right tailwinds behind you. But also, I think the biggest thing is just building a place where folks feel comfortable to join in at whatever level they can contribute and feel welcome to do that. I think is the biggest key to success there. And I think, it's just, I'm lucky to be, a part of that. Even if like, the things that we were doing with the seed crystal, it was really, it was so many other folks coming together to make it happen. And I think also some of that was, Greg helped to sort of set up and motivate the CNCF out of this. And I think some of that was conceptualizing a foundation that was more than just Kubernetes, right? I think it would have been very
Yeah.
easy to say, hey, let's create the Kubernetes foundation. But in some ways, that would have tried to move too much under the Kubernetes umbrella. And I think letting go and letting projects that are, complementary but not part of Kubernetes flourish on their own, I think is a big part of the success formula here. Also, you got to leave room for folks to do interesting things outside of the thing that you
Yeah,
feel some control over.
I agree. I think it was smart as well, right? If you go back to the Mythos Marathon kind of mantra and you think of the catalog of applications that you could deploy onto Mythos, you were kind of creating a foundation where other catalogs of applications can come and leverage the work that you and the team had done, and produce that kind of abstraction layer on top for them to be able to deploy those workloads onto. So yeah, it makes a ton of sense to me. Um, and then after Google, I know you co-founded Heptio. So kind of what inspired that move and like what were you hoping to achieve?
Well, so I was pretty burned out actually, sort of after we launched Kubernetes, sort of that summer before we announced 1.0. And for me, I think, different people sort of experience burnout in different ways. I think, uh, for me, I feel the most burned out when I feel some responsibility over something where I want to get something done, but I don't have the tools to impact it. And so it really feels like you're pushing a rock up the hill and nothing's moving. And I was feeling that way at Google, to be honest. I think, it's part of that sort of tour of duty, that itch to do something different. Some of it is that I think even after we launched Kubernetes at Google, there were a lot of people who didn't appreciate it. And I think it's long enough ago, I don't mind sharing it. Like we shipped Kubernetes and I got a crappy review score. I got a
Oh wow.
3.0 at Google, which is a meets expectations, right? And that was essentially indication that leadership didn't think that I was on a path to get promoted and that I wasn't doing the right impactful things, right? Now, I believed that Kubernetes was going to be impactful and was going to be big, but there were a lot of people. I remember like one of the directors, product management directors at Google, was like, I know there's a unicorn there somewhere because of all the unicorn shit, right? It's just like they didn't have a sense of what we were trying to do and what we were building. And so that's part of like I was pushing hard, but I wasn't being effective, at least at Google.
Going back to the boat analogy.
Yeah, the boat analogy, right? And I definitely found myself in that trap. And you know, and so I think it was a natural time for me to take a break, and so I left, and I actually didn't have a real job for about a year and a half. I did nothing for about 6 months, and then I signed on as an entrepreneur in residence with Excel. So I'd been talking with some folks in the VC world, and I wasn't looking to start a company. And so it's interesting. I think I built some good relationships there because I could have a conversation with a partner and it wasn't about, please give me money. It was like, hey, let's look at the industry. What's interesting?
Mm.
What am I interested in? And it was sort of a more of a give and take type of thing versus a transactional, I'm looking for funding type of thing. And so I did the entrepreneur in residence there, which is just a way, I think, for at least the way that I did it, for the VC firm to take an option on you. They get to know you, you get to know them. If you do end up starting something, then any sort of deal will come together a lot easier because there's a basis of trust and
Hmm.
understanding between the firm and the entrepreneur. And so did that for about a year, and like Kubernetes continued to build, continued to see some success. And so it was really a if I'm ever going to do a startup, the situation's never going to be better than now, right?
Yeah.
And so finally, Craig was ready to leave Google, and so we went ahead and started Heptio, and that was quite the exciting journey there.
Yeah, definitely, right. And then leading kind of on from Heptio, that's when the TGIK, roller coaster ride, I guess, kind of started. Um, it's been such a valuable resource to the community. Like, how did it come about? What was the kind of idea behind it initially?
Well, I think, there wasn't a grand plan there. I think, the reality is that I was super busy with a bunch of the day-to-day stuff with Heptio. And meanwhile, I look around and there were so many interesting things going on across the larger community around Kubernetes. And I was feeling disconnected between like, hey, there's all this exciting stuff happening. I want to understand it. Um, I want to set aside time where I can take these things and get my hands dirty and play with it. And then I'm like, well, I might as well just like crack open a beer and start streaming on YouTube and see what happens. And so really, the thing was, just a chance on a Friday afternoon for me to hang out and play with something new and fun and learn. And I just figured it might as well sort of, start broadcasting it. And it kind of took on a little bit of a life of its own. And you'll watch the early episodes and I'm sitting there drinking a beer. Like not
I
so much
remember.
as it sort of we moved on, right? But early on it was mostly for me, I think more than anything else, where I wanted to take the time and set that aside to learn new things and keep up with everything that was happening in the community.
Yeah, kind of what did you learn, would you say, from that experience of kind of creating and hosting it specifically, right? I'm on this kind of journey myself, starting off in the kind of live stream YouTube world, and you're a veteran now. So have you got any kind of tips and tricks that
I
me and
think
anyone else listening can be aware of?
Yeah, I think some of it is again, it's creating that community. I mean, you'll watch anybody like gamers or whatever working on Twitch, and they get to know the folks that are there a lot of times in the chat. I think it was really interesting, I think, to see folks show up in the chat, show up in that sort of the community that we were building, and then I might sort of, go off to a KubeCon and actually meet those people. And it's like it was this really weird sort of like, you'd see these names scroll by and get to know folks week over week, and then you'd meet them in person, and I think it was really gratifying to have folks that were interested in sort of like learning with you and sort of creating those connections. But I think, whether it's doing TGIK or early on with Kubernetes, I think, you know, being welcoming to people and creating opportunities to get them involved. And it starts with one person. And I think, like, for example, early on, we were doing Kubernetes, and like this one guy was showing up all the time and had some interesting stuff to say and was giving talks about it, and ended up being Kelsey Hightower. And we're like, hey, like, why don't we like encourage him to contribute, encourage him to get more involved? And I think, if we hadn't been as encouraging to Kelsey, who knows, maybe he would have moved on to some other project, some other sort of technology. So I think a lot of these things start with, just finding somebody who's excited and getting excited with them. And it starts with that one person, and you never know where that's going to take you.
Yeah, I agree. And an interesting kind of like side note to that is that there was someone in the TGIK chats called Sevi, and she was from Amsterdam, or she is from Amsterdam. She's originally from Turkey, I think. And her and I were going back and forward on a number of TGIK episodes and had never met, and actually had lunch at KubeCon Paris,
Oh,
and
that's awesome. I love
met
it.
for the first time. Yeah, it was such a gratifying experience. Like, we were just talking about the old days when we used to watch you or Duffy or someone else uh, streaming on TGIK, and us going back and forward trying to work out and contribute. So yeah, it kind of came full circle, which was really great.
I think it was also, you mentioned Duffy. I think it was also really fun that, both Duffy and Nova brought their own personalities to it and did it their own way. And I think, I encourage them to do that. I'm like, hey, if you're going to be comfortable and if you're going to do something that you find useful and engaging, just go ahead and do it. And I think, that was part of the fun is people figuring out their own way of, making it fun and useful for themselves and for everybody else.
Yeah, definitely. They were all slightly different, but the kind of core message and what we were trying to achieve was still the same. So, kind of looking ahead, Joe, like, where do you see the cloud native ecosystem kind of going? Like, what excites you about the next kind of two to 5 years?
Um, I mean, I think the cloud. cloud in general, but cloud native, I think, it's entering sort of a different phase. I think, like I said, when I decided to join the IE team, it's like, hey, I don't know where this stuff is going, but it's exciting and it's dynamic. I think if you were going to apply that same test, 5, 6 years ago, maybe cloud native would have been it. If you were going to apply that test now, definitely AI would be the shiny thing that everybody's going after. And so I think there's a question of like, what does our community look like when sort of a lot of the attention has started to move off of cloud and off of cloud native. And I think it just means that it's in a different phase. And I think that it in some ways has to evolve, but I think it also speaks to the durability of the community that folks want to keep working on this just because they like the people, they like a lot of the technology, even if it's not the sort of the shiny hot thing. And that doesn't mean that there aren't overlaps, right? I know like NVIDIA, for example, is doing a lot of stuff with Kubernetes and GPUs and offering services on top of it. So there's opportunities that cross over here. But I think it's definitely moving into a different phase and it's more mature. Um, and so hopefully that we've established enough utility in enough places that there's folks that are like, hey, this is a good place to be. I'm still learning. I like the people I'm with. We're solving real problems beyond just sort of like, hey, this is an exciting place to be where everything's happening, right? Because it's not the hottest place to be right now, I think, anymore. Both cloud and cloud native. I mean, with cloud in general, you're seeing with the advent of AI, a lot of folks are moving workloads back on prem. And it's
Yes.
changing. I mean, it's probably good for cloud native and Kubernetes in a lot of ways, but it's changing essentially how people are relating to cloud, and that's evolving too.
What do you kind of think is the most significant challenge like we're facing as a kind of industry at the moment, would you say? Obviously, you've mentioned the words AI there.
Um, Well, I think, staying relevant as people start finding these new applications. And I think, there are a lot of folks that are doing both training and inference using Kubernetes. I think that's super interesting. I think, I think that you see these swings of the pendulum that, and staying centered as these things happen. For example, along with Kubernetes, you saw the rise of folks talking about microservices, right? And actually, I can dig it up. I'm probably back in like 2019, 2018. I gave a keynote at a LinuxCon, which, was what they called it at the time, warning against going too far with microservices. And I think we definitely saw that. We had people building what I would call pico services, where every function is a service type of thing. And it got to the point where people are looking at it going like, why do you have like 1,000 microservices for this application? That seems kind of crazy. And I think I would agree that's kind of crazy, right? So I think in some ways the pendulum swung towards like, hey, we have these tools, let's use them, in every situation. And now we're moving, the pendulum. And I think you'll see that now everybody's be like, oh, build monoliths. I don't think that's the right thing either. I think finding the right sort of happy medium in terms of how you take applications and break them down into services is something that I think we're still learning as an industry. And so I think, as we move past, I think, there's always going to be a backlash to stuff. Like people were super excited about Kubernetes. There's definitely going to be a movement. And if you read enough Twitter, which I try to avoid these days, there's people are like, why do you need any more than SSHing in and running a makefile or whatever, right? It's like, so, it's like, hopefully Kubernetes is useful for a set of things in the middle there, but I think it's definitely, there were times where people were using it in places where maybe it didn't belong and it wasn't applicable. But I think now there's times when people could maybe benefit, but they're like, oh no, I'm going to stay away from. So I think, you just gotta, I think part of being, maybe an old man in this industry is seeing these swings, seeing these cycles, and trying to find, okay, what is the useful thing? What is the happy medium here?
Yeah, we've got to go with the ebbs and flows, right? Of
Yeah.
some people want to put it all in Kubernetes, some people don't, and I think, but like in some scenarios, both of those are valid options. So one of the reasons why I kind of put this kind of community together was to inspire the next generation, right? And I've talked about how you helped me personally, and the idea is to kind of pay this forward. So what would you kind of tell professionals that they should kind of prepare for in the next, say, 2 to 3 years, if you were going to start your career from zero?
Um, Yeah, so a couple of things. I think, this idea of, for me, throughout my career, every time I've evaluated an opportunity, you have to decide what are the important things for you. And for me, it's been sort of like really who I work with. So I talked about sort of coming to Google. Um, what I work on, I want to work on something that is dynamic and new and expanding. Um, the old CFO of Google, or no, actually, I think it was Eric Schmidt, who's problematic in other ways these days. But when, early on at Google, he would say rising revenue solves all problems. And so there's a different environment when everybody feels like, hey, we're in this together. We're going to win together. Versus I think when things start to calm down a little bit, it's very easy for people to start thinking about things as zero sum. For me to win, you must lose, right? So
Yeah,
I would say seek out environments, seek out people, seek out problem spaces where there is these positive sum dynamics where everybody wins together. And yourself bring that dynamic where, hey, this isn't a competition. This isn't I win, you lose. This is we're going to all do something great together. So I would say seek out those types of environments. And then also I think, it pays to be careful about who you work for. Whether that be, I would say, as an engineer, you often have a lot of agency to pick your manager. And so find people that believe into you, that you can learn from, that will help advocate for you in your career. And recognize that oftentimes for you to be successful, you have to help them be successful, and they'll help you along the way there. So create those
definitely.
relationships where you can really be part of something bigger and go along for the ride as part of it. And I think we viewed that when we were taking investment also, because in some ways you take on investors, they're going to be on your board, they're going to be your boss, you get to pick your boss in some ways, so it applies at multiple levels. And if you find yourself in a situation where you don't feel like you're well supported, I think that's the time when it makes sense to start figuring out, where is best for you.
Yeah, I think that's really sound advice. I've taken some of those lessons myself, right? It's definitely more about the people that I work with now more than necessarily the technology. Like we said before, right? The tech is the easy and interesting part, but actually if you don't like the people that you're working with, it's actually not a good experience at all, even if you're using the latest and greatest tech.
Yeah. And I think, conversely, I think I've seen people where they've optimized for the most compensation that they can possibly get at every opportunity. And I think you'll find yourself trapped in a local maxima where you'll be making a lot of money, perhaps, but also I think you'll see people, there'll be lifestyle creep. They'll start to hate their job because they took the money over the people they're working with in the job. And as a sort of soothing mechanism, they'll actually start using the money that they're making to sort of try and sort of like, oh, I'm going to buy a fancy car or a bigger house or whatever. And in effect, they end up trapping themselves in a job that they don't like because their
Yeah.
lifestyle has creeped to the point where they don't have the optionality to actually change to something and maybe take a step back to take it two steps forward type of thing. And so I think, if you decide to optimize for compensation over everything else, I think, that can be your choice. But I also think you may find yourself not enjoying what you're doing and in a lot of real ways trapped in that job.
Yeah, I don't know if you're kind of familiar with the term ikigai, which is a Japanese for kind of it's your life purpose. It's I could talk about that for an hour, and maybe I should do my own stream about that. But it's very much around that and how different things overlap, and actually finding what truly does motivate you. And there's a combination of different parts, but I'll go into that in another time. So how do you hope your kind of contributions to the cloud native ecosystem will be remembered?
Um, I mean, I don't know. I hope that I I hope that, Kubernetes becomes sort of this, this common infrastructure. I think it's on its way, that a lot of folks just sort of assume is there. And whether it's Kubernetes or not, I think that there's definitely, whatever comes next is going to definitely be influenced by Kubernetes. And so whether it ends up being Kubernetes that has this sort of staying power or something else, I think we definitely made a dent in terms of what these things can and could look like. Um, I'm really proud of the work that we did for building the community. I think early on in the project, well, I mean, you contrast it with, say, like other projects where there's a sort of a BDFL, benevolent dictator for life. I think we worked really hard to build something that was community run. And early on, I think, when I talked about sort of, hey, we had a lot of engineers that had a common purpose, and there weren't a lot of arguments because we saw where things had to go. At some point, we had hard decisions to make, and there wasn't a time there where we had to essentially create governance out of thin air and try and slip it under the pre-existing project. And that was a really delicate thing to do. Um, and there were a set of 7 of us that got together and sort of like came up with the idea of the steering committee and how we were going to sort of like create elections and such there. And and there was a chance that we could have come up with these plans, and a lot of people in the community could have said, "Oh, this is total BS. We're gone." Right? And
Mhm.
you see this happen with open source projects where
Yeah.
people change the rules, change things up, and all of a sudden, a lot of the community is like, "Whoa, this is not what I thought it was," and then they leave. And so I'm really proud of the group of us that were able to come, to bring that together and bring the community along as we brought more structure. And hopefully that sets a good example, and that's something that's really durable too.
So I hope I don't mess up the name, but Ahan Tuvo asked a question, which was, do you have any advice on learning new stuff? For example, to learn ML/AI, there's a variety of offerings. So do you have any that you prefer?
Well, first on, nice to see you. We were at VMware together. Uh, I would say, my technique here is really one of just jumping with both feet and really start to play with stuff. And I think you saw that with TGIK. At the same time, I use that as a tool to, as quickly as possible, understand what are the core things, the core concepts that I really need to understand as part of this. And so, I'm in an interesting position where I left VMware like almost, a little over 2 years ago now. I haven't had a full-time job. I've been doing advising and investing, that type of thing. And all the AI stuff really happened, all the LLMs and open ChatGPT and all that stuff really exploded after I left. And so in some ways I've missed out on that at a professional level, but I've still spent time trying to understand what's happening there. And so some of it is playing with the tools, getting my hands dirty. Other parts is understanding what are the core concepts that I need to learn. And so really I think it's approaching things from both directions, both understanding the core concepts and understanding the reality of how people use these things. I think that's the critical thing. And I think if you focus too much on one or the other, you really miss out on developing a true deep understanding of the
Yeah, I
technology.
agreed. Right, there's the conceptual understanding, but I think the best learning, right, is to really kind of dig into the weeds and try and install something and break it and spend hours and hours and hours trying to work out what it was, and it's probably just like you spelt something wrong in one of the 100
Yeah.
YAML files that you need to deploy.
I mean, there's no replacement for sort of like that real experience there.
Agreed. So we're wrapping up on time, and we have a special tradition with all of the Cloud Native Club episodes, which is I get each guest to leave a question for the next guest without necessarily
Oh wow,
knowing who
okay.
they are. And it could be about anything. It could be their career, it could be cloud native tech, or kind of anything that you're specifically curious about. So, kind of what question would you like me to ask the next guest?
I would say like what are sort of the unique advantages you had, and what are some of the unique disadvantages that you had? And so I think, us being successful is recognizing where are the places where we're lucky and we have advantages, and these are things that give us a boost. And then, where are the places, because I think everybody has things that are working for them and working against them. And I think, understanding that is maybe a good thing to ask somebody.
And then subsequently, do you have any questions for me um,
Um,
before we wrap up?
Well, I mean, what made you wanna start a podcast here? So I think, before we started the show, you mentioned, I think, giving back to the community. Like what was your thinking in terms of starting this?
Yeah, so I played, my career was a little bit different to everybody else's. So I played professional sport until I was 18. And then from a number of injuries, I basically had to do the hardest pivot you've ever seen, um, and went into tech. And if it wasn't for certain people, yourself, Kelsey, Duffy, the list is endless, right? I wouldn't be in a position where I am today. And there's a number of people that I've met along this journey. Some that are in remote areas of the world and don't have what they would call a community around them, right? I remember specifically going to Dehradun in India, and there was a gentleman that I met there, and he was incredibly interested in learning about Kubernetes, but had no one around him that could support him. And obviously, there's a monetary element to be able to go to some of these conferences, um, and distance and travel and visas, et cetera, and people are still dealing with that today. And it was really about how could I bring a collective set of people together where we're better than the sum of our parts and we can help raise each other up, right? So the community right now has been going since July. We've got over 100 people. We've got people from Brazil and people from Australia and New Zealand, and they're all helping each other. And someone helped me fix a problem from Japan, and I've never met the person, but they joined the Cloud Native Club, and I went from not understanding something to understanding it. And I've fed back as well. And it's really about giving back to the community that gave me so much and actually helped me on this kind of big pivot that I went on way back when. So that's really the main driver behind it. And then another one kind of with the project spotlights as well, as the landscape is so vast. Like if you look at the CNCF landscape, you have to zoom out to see everything. And I think it's somewhat, to me at least, and probably many others, right? It's overwhelming when you're first looking at it. So it's really, can we get these bite-sized pieces of information and really understand and kind of talk directly to the maintainers and understand what the project is from layman's terms and kind of how they can get involved, right? Because it's very easy to start leveraging a tool and then not know how to deal with that situation when something doesn't work or something breaks. And there's some etiquette around that, and there's joining their community and joining their weekly calls. And it's really about getting people to be aware of that, because there's only so many Slack channels that I can be a part of without feeling overwhelmed. So it's having a centralized place for doing that as well. So they were the main reasons.
The cloud native landscape is interesting in that it's not uncommon to see these types sort of logo charts to try and understand a space. And VCs love to pull these things together. What's unique is that most of the time these things are mapping out companies or startups in a space. I think what's interesting about the cloud native landscape is that so much of that stuff are, open source projects and communities. And that's actually kind of a little bit of a unique thing, is that it's about sort of these things that are much more approachable than sort of, talk to a salesperson and try and buy a product type of thing in a particular space.
Definitely, right. And it's also like, it's been really interesting for me. I've learned a bunch of projects that I never would have heard of before. Like I take Adira as an example, right? I kind of loosely know Lewis from KubeCon and previous conferences, and I saw that he joined Adira, and I was like, "Well, what's Adira? I've never even heard of it." And then lo and behold, they announce it, and he's on the Cloud Native Club giving an example, right? And it's just
That's awesome.
raising up these projects that are brand new, but also giving ones that are more established a footprint as well.
Well, I would say, one more question, sort of a follow on for that, is that without naming names, have you seen some communities that didn't work? Sort of as you were coming at tech
Yes.
from sort of a non-tech background, were there things that you approached and just kind of bounced off of? And like, were there any lessons from that?
Yeah, obviously not naming names, but there was certain database technologies that I was interested in that were very much like, oh, you quite clearly haven't read the 100-page document on how you install this thing. Go and read that first. And that was very off-putting, right? For someone that doesn't really know how a database works at all, to be like, oh, please just go and read a document that I'm not going to understand a 100-page document at the beginning anyway. I need like absolute layman's terms. I'm like day zero of this installation and trying to figure out how this thing works. And that was very kind of off-putting. And I think the cloud native community was very different, right? I remember I asked Duffy probably what he would have deemed like a very, very interesting, like boring question. And he's like, oh, kind of no problem. Like, I'll explain to you how etcd works behind the scenes. And I remember when, shout out to Kelsey for this. He was the one that really got me into Kubernetes, because I could understand Docker Swarm and I could explain it to people higher up when we were talking about that at the beginning. But when you try and talk about Kubernetes, it's a little bit more complicated than Docker Swarm conceptually. And I was like, I don't know. I remember writing a tweet. I was like, I don't really know how to explain Kubernetes. And Kelsey was like, let's just jump on a Google chat and we can talk about it. And yeah, he spent half an hour for me. I didn't even know who he was. I didn't know how big and famous and well known he was. And he kind of explained Kubernetes as multiple bowls of fruit, and how you with the hands picking them up and moving them and deciding whether you wanted the banana next to the apple and the orange together. And it kind of clicked immediately, and I could explain it. And that was
That's
the
amazing.
difference. It was very engaging, and people were very willing to help. And I think that's been there since day one of me joining.
That's good to hear. Yeah, no, I think that's something that I'm not sure how we established that as sort of part of the community, but that idea that, we were all new at one point. None of this stuff, it, comes naturally to folks. You gotta help other people learn. So that's really good to hear.
Definitely. Yeah, from my side, Joe, it's been an absolute pleasure. Like to have you on, and for you to be the inaugural first episode, like the godfather of Kubernetes, as I call you to many of my friends. It's like an absolute pleasure and an honor. And yeah, thanks for sharing your incredible story, right, and leaving us with that intriguing question for the next guest. I'm actually thinking how I would answer that myself. And yeah, remember, Joe's not so available on Twitter nowadays, but he still does have a LinkedIn. So
Yeah, well, actually, so
you can
I
reach out.
do try and stay active on Blue Sky, which I
Okay.
think this is one of those technologies that I did a deep dive on, and I actually did a sort of TGIK-ish type of dive into that early on with Blue Sky. A lot of interesting stuff going on there. I'm also part of like some of my opportunities to invest with stuff. So I invested with Blue Sky also. So I think they're doing some interesting stuff.
I'll make sure that I get the link from Joe on the deep dive if it's available on the public internet, and I'll put it in the show notes.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. It's been a pleasure, yeah, and thanks very much for taking the time. And yeah, we'll be back next week with another cloud native pioneer who'll tackle Joe's question and share their journey. Until then, keep innovating, everyone, and remember to stay cloud native. Bye all.